Hello and welcome to this video on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, looking at the role of women in the novel. This one's obviously a huge topic. Before we get too deep into it though, let me give you a little overview about just the role of women in the 1800s in England, because it's very different to the way it is today. Here's a typical 1800s middle class or upper class woman wearing an outfit that is very similar to a hat that I've got actually. So let me give you a few brief notes then on the treatment of women in the 1800s. To begin with, when a woman married, she became the legal property of her husband. Crazy, isn't it? Women could not testify in court, women could not vote. It was believed that women were incapable of rational thought, and many female writers actually published their works anonymously or under male pseudonyms in order to boost their book sales. So Jane Austen published all of her novels anonymously. So although women could publish, women's literature was not taken as seriously as that written by men, and in order to be taken seriously, many women published anonymously. That gives us some idea on the role of women in society, so let's examine the key quotations in the text on this topic. Obviously, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to work out that Jane Austen probably didn't like the way that women were treated. Now, one of the earliest points established is the fact that women are to be admired physically by men. In chapter 5, Charlotte Lucas explains that she overheard Mr. Robinson asking Mr. Bingley whether he did not think that there were a great many pretty women in the room. Now, it's perhaps odd to see even high society acting in such an overtly physical and sexual manner, the men surveying the women and judging who's the most attractive. It's surprising how open and indiscreet this conversation between the men was. All of the surrounding women could hear how they were being talked about, and even more shocking is the fact that the women, on recounting the story in this chapter, are proud and celebratory of the comments that Jane received. Now, whilst men may act as improperly as they feel, brazenly and openly judging women on their looks, women, of course, cannot act in the same way. It's Charlotte Lucas, once again, who explains the role of a woman must take if interested in a man. She argues that in 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more affection than she feels. So the role of women is here made very clear. They must work hard to attract the men they're interested in. Men may act with a careless nonchalance, but women must fight for their man. The importance of physical appearance is further explored in the same chapter in Austen's description of Mary. Of course, here's Mary on the screen from the 90s version. This bit I think is probably the most shocking of all. So the description of Mary is that having, in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments. Now this once again enforces the idea that a woman's looks are vital in all pursuit of marriage. If you suffer the misfortune of not being beautiful, in other words being plain, you'll have to make up for it with knowledge. Then we see Mr. Darcy commenting on Elizabeth's eyes, also in the same chapter, where he explains that women's eyes can give a man great pleasure. And once again, we see that women's physicality serves the purpose of giving pleasure to men. It's as if that's what women exist for, to just kind of make men happy. But it's not just as simple as that. Women do put a great deal of pressure on themselves too. When Elizabeth walks to Longbourn to see her sister Jane, who's sick, the Bingleys mock the fact that she decided to walk 3 miles or 4 miles or 5 miles or whatever it is above her ankles in dirt. And here we can see the Bingley sisters reinforce the concept that a woman should be attractive to the eye at all times. A kind of laughable bit in the same chapter is where Mr. Hurst is amazed to see Elizabeth reading a book. He asks her, "Do you prefer reading to cards? That is rather singular." So in Austen's time, card games were a regular pastime, and Mr. Hurst's amazement suggests that he expects women to spend their time in meaningless fun and games, not to become better educated through reading a book. So at this point it's clear that women are not taken seriously, but are merely seen as existing for the pleasure of men. However, Mr. Darcy and Caroline Bingley together define the accomplished woman a little later in chapter 8. There's this ridiculous description of what a perfect woman should be, A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. All this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Well, of course, unsurprisingly, Elizabeth is perplexed at this definition, arguing that she herself never saw such a woman. And this, I think, is the voice of Jane Austen shining through, criticising the unrealistic expectations placed on women in the Regency period. Women were expected to be perfect. It would later be known in the Victorian period as the angel in the house, the expectation that women would be submissive, beautiful, passive, powerless, self-sacrificing, and more. Now, the problem with this expectation of women, or one of the problems, is that no such woman exists, as Elizabeth points out. So as a result, women were under extreme pressure to try to be the perfect woman, and here Austen is showing just how unrealistic these expectations were. The list of ideals from Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy is as follows: that you can play music, sing, draw, dance, read and speak a number of languages, walk in a certain way, talk in a certain way, and read excessively. This list is ridiculous. These are the areas in which upper-class girls would be tutored at a young age, and the idea is that this is what all women were aspiring to be. Only men would learn of law, medicine, science, maths, and the like. A woman's education and whole life was based around possessing a variety of skills which would be pleasurable to her husband. This expectation of women is juxtaposed with the minimal expectation of men in society. Just take Mr. Collins as an example. He's a laughable idiot and yet has risen to a fair height in society. The same could never be said of a woman. But if the life of a woman in Austen's era is unfair, it's also unavoidable. In chapter 13, Mr. Bennet reminds his daughters that Mr. Collins has a right, when I am dead, to turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. And what Mr. Bennet, of course, is referring to is the act of entailment. As the Bennets were a rich family, and let me just explain this entailment thing to you, Mr. Bennet's father entailed his property. Now this means the entire wealth went to one person, the eldest son, and that way the wealth and property would remain strong and undiluted. What does that mean? Well, if Mr. Bennet's father had 5 sons, the wealth would soon be divided into such small amounts it would not count for much at all. So Mr. Bennet, as the eldest son, inherited everything, and Mr. Collins's father, Mr. Bennet's brother, inherited nothing. And this tradition passes on to future generations too, but Mr. Bennet has no sons, and so the nearest male heir inherits everything. And the big point here is that women were seen as so inferior they were not recognised in entailment law, which is further explained in chapter 50, when it says, when first Mr. Bennet had married, economy was held to be perfectly useless, for of course they were to have a son. This soon was to join in cutting off the entail, as soon as he should be of age, and the widow and younger children would by that means be provided for. 5 daughters successively entered the world, but yet the son was to come, and Mrs. Bennet for many years after Lydia's birth had been certain that he would. This event had at last been despaired of, but it was then too late to be saving. Mrs. Bennet had no turn for economy, and her husband's love of independence had alone prevented their exceeding their income. An estate did not have to be entailed. There's a bit of confusion over this. I think because we see the entailment, we assume that's just the way it was, but it's not. With Lady Catherine, her estate is going to be inherited by her daughter. However, once an estate was entailed, there was no room for females to inherit anything, and this left many women in a very tough situation. They simply had to marry a rich man in order to live a rich life. They could only carry on this sort of excessive and sort of rich lifestyle if they married someone equally or more rich than themselves. Women are often portrayed in negative terms in the novel. In chapter 15, the younger Bennet girls are looking for a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window. And this vain obsession with fashion is seen throughout the novel, although it perhaps cannot be blamed on the girls when we've already established the importance of marriage and the fact that men will judge them solely on their looks. Most women in the novel seem accepting of their fate. Lady Catherine tells Elizabeth in chapter 13 that daughters are never of so much consequence to a father, and that young women should always be properly guarded and attended. This seems to be a contradiction. On the one hand, women are not important, but on the second, their dignity should always be protected. Of course, the latter is to protect a woman's virginity. Women who engaged in sexual activity before marriage were not at all respected. So just when it seems that women suffer the most awful discrimination, Austen shows us that men are not treated much better at times. In chapter 39, Lydia criticises the waiter as an ugly fellow. I'm glad he's gone. I never saw such a long chin in my life. To see Lydia treat a man in exactly the same way men treat women is quite an interesting moment in the text. Austen also suggests that much of the pressure women feel is self-inflicted. In chapter 39, Lydia exclaims, "Jane will be quite an old maid soon, I declare. She's almost 23. Lord, how ashamed I should be of not being married before 23." The words of Lydia are used by Austen to criticise how women of the era were so accepting of their plight. We know from the author's own life and her rejection of a marriage proposal that Austen did not see marriage as something to be eagerly grasped at upon the first chance. Austen's presentation of the treatment of women, then, is that much of it is self-inflicted, and it can be read as a scathing criticism of a society which had such unrealistic and unfair expectations of women. Well, I hope you found this rather long video useful. Do pick up a copy of my revision guide through following a link in the description.